Arafat dies and nothing changes. Arafat died in November 2004, and Abbas emerged as the Palestinians' new leader, eventually winning office in January 2005 in a peaceful democratic election that was hailed by outside observers as free and fair. One would think that this event would have been an ideal opportunity to push the peace process forward, as Abbas recognized Israel, renounced terrorism, and was eager to work out a negotiated settlement to the conflict. Furthermore, Bush had just won re-election to a second term, and thus was in about as good a position as any president could be to help bolster the moderate Abbas. The Bush administration embraced the new Palestinian leader from the start, but it did virtually nothing to help him negotiate a viable state, and so ultimately undermined his power base. The main reason Bush did little to help Abbas was that he had already committed himself to supporting Sharon's plan, and that of his successor, Ehud Olmert, to disengage unilaterally from the Palestinians. Contrary to his own pronouncements about the necessity of the roadmap, Bush was backing a strategy that held no promise of the Palestinians getting a viable state of their own, which doomed the plan from the start. Some pro-Israel groups, like the Zionist Organization of America and the Orthodox organizations, were opposed to giving up any territory to the Palestinians. But the major organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Congress, and the American Jewish Committee backed disengagement. Senior officials in the Conference of Presidents estimated that somewhere between 60 and 75% of the leaders favored the pullout, which was more than enough to ensure that the lobby ultimately backed Sharon and Bush's shift in policy, although not with great enthusiasm. By refusing to negotiate with Abbas and making it impossible for him to deliver tangible benefits to the Palestinian people, Sharon's strategy contributed directly to Hamas's electoral victory in January 2006. The Haaretz columnist Bradley Burston wrote just before that election, "If it appears to you that Israel is Hamas's campaign manager in next week's elections for the Palestinian parliament, few would argue, especially in Hamas." With Hamas in power, Israel had another reason not to negotiate, and the Bush administration was even less likely to push them to talk with the Palestinians. To make matters worse, Israel's policy of unilateral disengagement collapsed in the summer of 2006, about 2 months after Bush had hailed the policy during Ehud Olmert's first visit to the White House as the new prime minister. After pulling out of Gaza in August 2005, the Israelis effectively cordoned off that small piece of real estate, making it impossible for the Palestinians living there to lead a decent life, much less have a state of their own. The Palestinians in Gaza continued launching rockets into Israel, and then they captured an Israeli soldier on June 25, 2006. The Israelis felt that the situation had become intolerable, so 3 days later they re-entered Gaza. It quickly became apparent to most Israelis, and certainly to Olmert, that Israel would face a similar situation if it unilaterally withdrew from some parts of the West Bank and effectively locked up the Palestinians left behind. A few weeks later, on July 12, Hezbollah captured 2 Israeli soldiers along the Israel-Lebanon border, precipitating a war in which Hezbollah fired rockets and missiles into northern Israel. Given that Israel had unilaterally withdrawn from southern Lebanon in 2000, this crisis reinforced the point that simply pulling back from parts of the West Bank would not by itself end Israel's conflict with the Palestinians. Consequently, with the Israeli public behind him, Olmert abandoned unilateral disengagement in the late summer of 2006. In a candid interview with the Chinese news agency Xinhua in January 2007, Olmert said that when he took over from the incapacitated Sharon in January 2006, he was confident that a unilateral strategy, or what he called his convergence plan, could solve the Palestinian problem. But he was wrong, and now, under the existing circumstances, it would be more practical to achieve a two-state solution through negotiations rather than unilateral withdrawal. Rice gets Powellized. The Bush administration had also figured out that unilateralism was a losing strategy, and it began pushing again for a negotiated settlement along the lines of the roadmap. In late 2006, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice took the lead in trying to get the Palestinian and Israeli leaders talking to each other. Her goal was to start a discussion about what the broad outlines of a comprehensive settlement, which she termed the political horizon, should look like. While Rice was pushing the Israelis and the Palestinians to negotiate seriously, the Saudis convinced the Arab League in March 2007 to reissue its 2002 peace plan. The new proposal, like the original one, offered Israel peace and normal relations not just with the Palestinians, but with all 22 members of the Arab League. In return, Israel would have to withdraw from all of the occupied territories and the Golan Heights, accept the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state in the occupied territories with East Jerusalem as its capital, and negotiate a just solution to the Palestinian refugee problem that was agreed upon by the relevant parties. The Saudis made it clear that the proposal was a basis for negotiation, not a take-it-or-leave-it deal. Both the Americans and the Saudis had powerful incentives to put an end to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Continuing U.S. support for Israeli policies in the occupied territories was not only helping fuel America's terrorism problem, but it was making it difficult for the Bush administration to get Arab states to help it deal with the war in Iraq and Iran's nuclear program. The Saudis, for their part, wanted to work closely with the Americans to contain Iran, but they were limited in what they could do because there was so much anger among the Saudi people over U.S. support for Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. The Saudis also wanted to end the conflict because Iran was gaining influence with radical Palestinian forces in the occupied territories. Given these circumstances, conditions would seem ripe for serious movement forward in the peace process. But that did not happen. Olmert showed little interest in the Arab League initiative, which appeared destined to share the same fate as the 2002 peace proposal. The Israeli Prime Minister was unhappy with some parts of the proposal, such as the stipulation that Israel would have to withdraw from all of the occupied territories. He also rejected any compromise on the issue of a Palestinian right of return, telling the Jerusalem Post in March 2007, "I will not agree to any kind of Israeli responsibility for this problem. Full stop." He went on to say that the return of even one Palestinian refugee to Israel was out of the question. But that point of dispute and any others could have been dealt with in the negotiations that would have ensued if Israel had agreed to talks on the basis of the proposal. Haaretz put the point well in a late March editorial. A realistic government would have rushed to embrace this willingness for recognition and reconciliation, expressing reservations for what it does not accept and seeking dialogue on the regional level. In mid-May, Olmert was widely criticized for failing to seriously pursue peace with the Arabs, including by two staunch supporters of Israel, Abraham Foxman of the ADL and the Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel. In the face of this mounting criticism, the Prime Minister responded by saying that Israel was willing to discuss the Arab League initiative, but he has taken little action beyond his rhetoric. Instead, Israel has launched a diplomatic campaign to blame the Arabs for the failure of the peace initiative. The Bush administration did nothing substantive to push Olmert to embrace the Arab League's proposal, although it did urge Arab leaders to alter the proposal to Israel's liking. So far, Rice's own efforts to push the peace process forward have come to naught. For starters, Rice made it clear in an early February 2007 meeting with leaders from 15 major Jewish organizations that not only would the administration refrain from putting pressure on Israel, but it would not offer its own suggestions on what the political horizon might look like. Those concessions greatly limited the secretary's effectiveness. Rice then traveled to Jerusalem, where, on February 19, she brought Olmert and Abbas together for talks. But Rice's efforts to revive the peace talks were a bust, as the Israeli Prime Minister refused to discuss the outlines of a possible settlement. In fact, both Olmert and Abbas refused to appear with her at the press conference afterward. Shortly thereafter, the New York Times ran an editorial on the meeting titled "Charade in Jerusalem," which pointed out that Rice could not even get the two leaders to stand at her side while she read a content-free joint statement to which they... In late March 2007, Rice returned to Israel to meet with Olmert and raised the possibility that she might serve as a mediator between Israel and the Palestinians. It was her 7th visit to Israel in 8 months. Olmert flatly rejected the idea of Rice acting as a diplomatic broker, forcing her to cancel the press conference planned for after the meeting. The Daily Telegraph, London, headlined the day after the Olmert-Rice meeting said it all: "Israel snubs Condoleezza Rice." The Secretary of State returned to Washington empty-handed and with little prospect that the Bush administration would make meaningful progress toward Arab-Israeli peace before leaving office. This outcome, which is not only humiliating for the Secretary of State, but is contrary to America's national interest as well, is the result of at least 2 factors. First, Olmert, like his predecessor Sharon, has no interest in negotiating a peace settlement with the Palestinians, because it would require Israel to give up almost all of the West Bank and create a viable Palestinian state on that territory. Olmert has made it clear that he would be willing to give up some parts of the West Bank, but he intends to keep large parts of it for Israel. Indeed, his government announced in late December 2006 that it was constructing its first new settlement in the West Bank in 10 years. And the following month, Israel announced that it planned to build new houses in Malaya Adumim, Israel's largest existing settlement. Israel would prefer the occupation to peace if the latter means giving 95% or so of the West Bank to the Palestinians. One might argue that the real obstacle to peace is not Israel but Hamas, which came to power in January 2006 and remains formally committed to Israel's destruction. There is no question that having Hamas dominate the Palestinian National Authority seriously complicates any efforts to achieve peace. Nevertheless, this problem is not insurmountable. If the Israelis were genuinely interested in reaching a peace agreement with the Palestinians, they could work with the Arab League, Abbas, and the more moderate elements within Hamas to push the peace process forward and isolate or maybe even convert the rejectionists in Hamas and other radical groups like Islamic Jihad. But instead, the Israelis have shown little enthusiasm for working with the growing number of Arabs who are genuinely interested in making peace with the Jewish state. By undermining moderates who want to negotiate peace, this policy merely strengthens those factions that claim that violence is the only effective tactic. Second, pro-Israel forces in the United States have made it impossible for the United States, especially Secretary of State Rice, to push the Olmert government toward peace. Inside the White House, the main obstacle to putting any kind of meaningful pressure on Israel is Elliott Abrams. He has help, however, from two powerful neoconservatives who work for the vice president, John Hanna and David Wormser. The journalist Jim Loeb reports that various sources have told him that Abrams has been working systematically to undermine any prospect for serious negotiations designed to give substance to Rice's hopes and increasingly impatient demands by Saudi King Abdullah of offering the Palestinians a political horizon for a final settlement. Abrams has a close relationship with Yoram Turbowitz, Olmert's chief of staff, and Shalom Turgeman, Olmert's diplomatic advisor, who all work together to make sure that the Bush administration does not push Israel to pursue policies that Olmert dislikes. Daniel Levy, a former advisor in the Israeli Prime Minister's office, notes that if Rice is getting too active with her peacemaking quest, then TNT, Yoram Turbowitz and Shalom Turgeman, can always be dispatched to Elliott Abrams at the White House, who in turn will enlist Cheney to keep the president in tow. Correspondingly, Henry Siegman, who long worked on Middle East issues at the Council on Foreign Relations, maintains that every time there emerged the slightest hint that the United States may finally engage seriously in a political process, Elliott Abrams would meet secretly with Olmert's envoys in Europe or elsewhere to reassure them that there exists no such danger. Right before Rice arrived in Israel for her February 19 meeting with Abbas and Olmert, the Israeli Prime Minister put the Secretary of State in her place by letting the media know that he had talked to Bush the day before and that the Prime Minister and President see eye to eye. As Aluf Ben and Shmuel Rosner wrote in Haaretz, the message was unmistakable. What Rice had to say, the extent to which the balance of power inside the Bush administration is stacked against Rice, is further illustrated by Philip Zelikows' resignation as the State Department's counselor at the end of 2006. He was Rice's longtime friend and co-author, and one of her closest advisors. By the late summer of 2006, he was encouraging Rice to make a serious effort to negotiate a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. He felt that was essential if Washington hoped to get the Arab states and the Europeans to form an effective coalition against Iran. He made this very point on September 15, 2006, in a speech at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Following the speech, there was an immediate outcry from pro-Israel groups, and, according to the New York Times, the State Department quickly distanced itself from the speech, issuing a statement denying any linkage, and Israeli officials, flustered by Mr. Zelikows' remarks, said Ms. Rice later assured the Israeli Foreign Minister, Tzipi Livni, that the United States saw the Iranian and Palestinian issues as two separate matters. Zelikow announced he was leaving the State Department the following month. He gave anodyne reasons for his departure in his resignation letter, although one unnamed White House source said that his departure was due in part to his unhappiness with U.S. Middle East policy. In early March 2007, Rice named Eliot Cohen, a neoconservative who had signed all the earlier PNAC letters, as Zelikows' successor. Despite the restrictions on her room to maneuver, Rice has tried to help strengthen Abbas at the expense of Hamas. But the lobby has limited her effectiveness on that front as well. Specifically, President Bush decided in late January 2007 to give Abbas $86 million to beef up his security forces. But Congresswoman Nita Lowey, Democrat New York, a stalwart defender of Israel and the chair of an important appropriations subcommittee, held up the request. Another pro-Israel lawmaker, Anthony Weiner, wrote to Rice and asked her to withdraw the requested money. Morton Klein, president of the Zionist Organization of America, weighed in, saying that Bush should be as tough on Abbas as he is on Hamas and al-Qaeda. Klein's uncompromising views on Abbas were shared by many Jewish leaders. They were especially upset with Abbas for agreeing in February 2007 to join a unity government with Hamas, even though the Palestinian president made it clear that he remained committed to negotiating a two-state settlement and living in peace with Israel. Aipac tried to push Congress to make it impossible for the U.S. government to deal with anyone in the unity government, Abbas included, but that effort failed. To mollify Lowy, the administration reduced the requested amount to $59 million and stipulated that it would be used only for training, purchasing non-lethal equipment, and improving security at a critical crossing point between Israel and Gaza. Lowy consented to this arrangement, and the money was authorized. Nevertheless, the Bush administration's efforts to isolate and marginalize Hamas backfired in June 2007, when Hamas preempted the American attempt to strengthen Fatah's security forces by driving them from Gaza and seizing power there. In a belated effort to bolster Abbas, Israel has promised to release Palestinian prisoners as well as withheld Palestinian tax revenues, and Jerusalem and Washington have lifted some economic restrictions. But there is no sign that Israel will give the Palestinian leader the one thing he needs to establish his authority and trump the rejectionists: the realistic prospect of a viable state. Thus, the conflict will continue to fester, doing further damage to America's position in the Arab and Islamic world. Conclusion. Absent the lobby, the Bush administration almost certainly would have been much more self-interested and hard-nosed in pushing for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. After all, the United States has a rich history, especially in recent years, of using various tools to force other states to change their behavior to suit America's interests. Washington extracted repeated concessions from Soviet leaders as the Soviet Union broke up, and it later pressed Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus to give up their nuclear arsenals. A similar effort eventually persuaded Libya to give up its own weapons of mass destruction programs in exchange for a lifting of extensive economic sanctions. The Clinton administration fought an intense air war to force Serbia to withdraw from Kosovo in 1999, and the Bush administration has pressured numerous countries to reject the convention establishing an international criminal court. And as we discuss at length in Chapter 10, the United States has gone to considerable lengths to convince Iran to give up its own nuclear ambitions. Putting pressure on Israel, the Palestinians, and the relevant Arab states in order to reach a final peace arrangement would hardly be inconsistent with America's conduct on other issues. The United States has enormous potential leverage at its disposal for dealing with Israel and the Palestinians. It could threaten to cut off all economic and diplomatic support for Israel. If that were not enough, it would have little difficulty lining up international support to isolate Israel, much the way South Africa was singled out and shunned at the end of the last century. Regarding the Palestinians, the United States could hold out the promise of fulfilling their dream of a viable state in the occupied territories, coupled with massive long-term economic aid. In return, the Palestinians would have to end all terrorism against Israel. Given the political divisions within Israel and the often dysfunctional Palestinian leadership, as well as the presence of violent rejectionists on both sides, achieving a final settlement would not be easy. But doing nothing, or backing Israel so consistently has not made things better. On the contrary, this policy has almost certainly made things worse for Palestinians and Israelis alike, and continues to erode America's reputation in the world and make it more difficult to deal with urgent issues like Iran and Iraq. It might be argued that this analysis is unrealistic, given Israel's generally favorable image in the eyes of many Americans. In this view, the real reason Bush has backed Israel against the Palestinians is that U.S. public opinion strongly favors Israel. The president, in short, is just responding to the will of the people. We have seen this claim before. It is the heart of the moral rationale for the special relationship between the United States and Israel. Yet this interpretation ignores the evidence that the American people would be willing to put pressure on Israel if it were part of a larger peace deal. Although U.S. surveys show greater sympathy for Israel than for the Palestinians, they also reveal considerable support for a more even-handed policy. For example, most Americans were generally supportive of Bush's efforts to be tough on Israel in the spring of 2002. A Time CNN poll taken on April 10th and 11th found that 60% of Americans felt that U.S. aid to Israel should be cut off or reduced if Sharon refused to withdraw from the Palestinian areas he had recently occupied. Moreover, 75% of those surveyed thought that Powell should meet with Arafat when he visited Israel. Regarding Sharon, only 35% found him trustworthy, while 35% thought he was a warmonger, 20% saw him as a terrorist, and 25% considered him an enemy. 1 year later, a May 2003 poll conducted by the University of Maryland reported that over 60% of Americans would be willing to withhold aid to Israel if it resisted U.S. pressure to settle the conflict. That number rose to 70% among politically active Americans. Indeed, 73% said that the United States should not favor either side in the conflict. It is also worth noting that only 17% of respondents agreed with the claim made by Bush and Sharon that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is part of the war on terrorism. Instead, 54% viewed it as a conflict between two national groups fighting over the same piece of land. The same survey showed that although most Americans did not know much about the roadmap, 55% had a positive view of it. When informed of its key elements, support rose to 74%. Even a 2005 survey conducted by the ADL found that 78% of Americans believed that their government should favor neither Israel nor the Palestinians. Since September 11, the American people have been receptive to pressuring Israel when they believed that doing so would be in the U.S. national interest. President Bush has also recognized that getting the Palestinians a viable state of their own was the only way to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and his administration has tried to advance that goal on several occasions. But neither public opinion nor presidential initiatives mattered very much, because the lobby has made it nearly impossible for the United States to put pressure on Israel to negotiate a settlement. As we have seen, Bush formally endorsed the idea of a Palestinian state in the fall of 2001. In the spring of 2002, he called for Israel to withdraw its forces from several Palestinian areas in the West Bank and sent Secretary of State Colin Powell to the region to jumpstart the peace process. That same summer, Bush launched the Roadmap Initiative, which was supposed to provide a clear timetable leading to an independent and democratic Palestinian state. The following year, Bush traveled to the Middle East to promote the roadmap. After the collapse in 2006 of the Israeli plan to impose a unilateral settlement on the Palestinians, the administration, with Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in the lead, made a renewed effort to end the conflict. In each case, the lobby moved quickly and effectively to neutralize the Bush administration's efforts. Groups in the lobby employed a variety of tactics: open letters, congressional resolutions, op-eds and press releases, and direct meetings between administration officials and the leaders of influential Jewish and evangelical groups. Sympathetic government officials, such as the NSC's Elliott Abrams, helped in these efforts, at times meeting with Israeli officials to thwart ongoing initiatives. Instead of using U.S. leverage to move toward peace, for example, by linking U.S. support to Israel's cooperation on the roadmap, Bush ended up instead backing Sharon's and now Olmert's chosen policy at every turn. As former National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft declared in October 2004, Sharon had President Bush wrapped around his little finger. Israel's ability to defy the United States, and even to get Washington to follow its preferred approach to dealing with the Palestinians, offers a classic illustration of interest group politics at work. Although public opinion polls show that the American people would support compelling Israel to offer the Palestinians a fair settlement, groups in the lobby, and especially its more hardline elements, care more about this issue than the average American does. As a result, groups like Aipac and the leaders of organizations like the Conference of Presidents can put disproportionate pressure on elected officials, and their policy preferences are more likely to win out, even if they are bad for the United States as a whole and unintentionally harmful for Israel as well. Maintaining U.S. support for Israel's policies against the Palestinians is a core goal of many groups in the lobby, but their objectives are not limited to that goal. They also want America to help Israel remain the dominant regional power. The Israeli government and pro-Israel groups in the United States have worked together to shape the Bush administration's policy toward Iraq, Syria, and Iran, as well as its grand scheme for reordering the Middle East. Let us now consider how the lobby and Israel influenced America's decision to invade Iraq in March 2003, in the hope that this bold stroke would lead to the democratization of the entire region. Chapter 8: Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East. Why did the United States invade Iraq? In The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, George Packer declares that it still isn't possible to be sure, and this remains the most remarkable thing about the Iraq War. He quotes Richard Haass, the director of policy planning in the State Department during Bush's first term and now president of the Council on Foreign Relations, saying that he would go to his grave not knowing the answer. In one sense, their uncertainty is understandable, because the decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein even now seems difficult to fathom. He was clearly a brutal tyrant with worrisome ambitions, including a desire to obtain WMD. But his own incompetence had put these dangerous objectives out of reach. His army had been routed in the 1991 Gulf War and further weakened by a decade of UN sanctions. As a result, Iraq's military power, never impressive except on paper, was a pushover by 2003. Intrusive UN inspections had eliminated Iraq's nuclear program and eventually led Saddam to destroy his biological and chemical weapons stockpiles as well. There were no convincing links between Saddam and Osama bin Laden, who were in fact hostile to each other, and bin Laden and his associates were in Afghanistan or Pakistan, not Iraq. Yet in the aftermath of 9/11, when one would have expected the United States to be focusing laser-like on al-Qaeda, the Bush administration chose to invade a deteriorating country that had nothing to do with the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and was already effectively contained. From this perspective, it is a deeply puzzling decision. From another angle, however, the decision is not that hard to understand. The United States was the world's most powerful country, and there was never any doubt about its ability to oust Saddam if it so chose. The United States had not only won the long Cold War, it had also enjoyed a remarkable run of military successes after 1989, defeating Iraq handily in 1991, halting the Balkan bloodletting in 1995, and beating Serbia in 1999. The rapid ouster of the Taliban in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 reinforced an image of military invincibility and made it harder for skeptics on Iraq to convince others that going to war was unnecessary and unwise. Americans were also shocked and alarmed by 9/11, and many of their leaders were convinced that the United States could not allow even remote dangers to grow in an era when terrorists might acquire WMD. Those who favored war believed that toppling Saddam would convince other rogue states that America was simply too powerful to oppose, and compel these regimes to conform to U.S. wishes instead. In the period before the war, in short, the United States was simultaneously powerful, confident of its military prowess, and deeply worried about its own security, a dangerous combination. These various elements form the strategic context in which the decision for war was made, and help us understand some of the underlying forces that facilitated that choice. But there was another variable in the equation, and the war would almost certainly not have occurred had it been absent. That element was the Israel-Lobby, and especially a group of neoconservative policymakers and pundits who had been pushing the United States to attack Iraq since well before 9/11. The pro-war faction believed that removing Saddam would improve America's and Israel's strategic position and launch a process of regional transformation that would benefit the United States and Israel alike. Israeli officials and former Israeli leaders supported these efforts because they were eager to see the United States topple one of their main regional adversaries, and the man who had launched Scud missiles at Israel in 1991. Pressure from Israel and the lobby was not the only factor behind the Bush administration's decision to attack Iraq in March 2003, but it was a critical element. Many Americans believed that this was a war for oil or for corporations like Halliburton, but there is little direct evidence to support this claim, and considerable evidence that casts doubt on it. Other observers blame political advisers such as the Republican strategist Karl Rove and suggest that the war was part of a Machiavellian scheme to keep the country on a war footing and thus ensure a lengthy period of Republican control. This view has a certain partisan appeal, but it too lacks supporting evidence and cannot explain why so many prominent Democrats supported going to war. Another interpretation views the war as the first step in a bold effort to transform the Middle East by spreading democracy. This view is correct, but as we will see, this remarkably ambitious scheme was inextricably linked to concerns about Israel's security. In contrast to these alternative explanations, we argue that the war was motivated, at least in good part, by a desire to make Israel more secure. This was a controversial claim before the war started, but it is even more controversial now that Iraq has turned into a strategic disaster. To be clear, The individuals and groups that pushed for war believed it would benefit both Israel and the United States, and they certainly did not anticipate the debacle that ultimately occurred. Regardless, a proper account of the lobby's role in encouraging the war is ultimately a question of evidence, and there is considerable evidence that Israel and pro-Israel groups, especially the neoconservatives, played important roles in the decision. Before examining the evidence, however, it is worth noting that a number of knowledgeable and well-respected individuals have said openly that the war was linked with Israel's security. Philip Zelikow, a member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, 2001 to 2003, Executive Director of the 9/11 Commission, and counselor to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, 2005 to 2006, told a University of Virginia audience on September 10, 2002, that Saddam was not a direct threat to the United States. The real threat, he argued, is the threat against Israel. He went on to say, "And this is the threat that dare not speak its name, because the Europeans don't care deeply about that threat, and the American government doesn't want to lean too hard on it rhetorically, because it is not a popular sell." General Wesley Clark, the retired NATO commander and former presidential candidate, said in August 2002 that those who favor this attack now will tell you candidly and privately that it is probably true that Saddam Hussein is no threat to the United States, but they are afraid that at some point he might decide, if he had a nuclear weapon, to use it against Israel. In January 2003, a German journalist asked Ruth Wedgwood, a prominent neoconservative academic and a member of the influential Defense Policy Board, chaired by Richard Pearl, why the journalist should support the war. "I could be impolite," Wedgwood said, "and remind Germany of its special relationship with Israel. Saddam presents an existential threat to Israel. That is simply true." Wedgwood did not justify the war by saying that Iraq posed a direct threat to Germany or the United States. A few weeks before the United States invaded Iraq, the journalist Joe Klein wrote in Time magazine, "A stronger Israel is very much embedded in the rationale for war with Iraq. It is a part of the argument that dare not speak its name, a fantasy quietly cherished by the neoconservative faction in the Bush administration and by many leaders of the American Jewish community." Former Senator Ernest Hollings made a similar argument in May 2004. After noting that Iraq was not a direct threat to the United States, he asked why we invaded that country. The answer, which he said everyone knows, is because we want to secure our friend Israel. A number of Jewish groups promptly labeled Hollings an anti-Semite, with the ADL calling his comments reminiscent of age-old anti-Semitic canards about a Jewish conspiracy to control and manipulate government. Hollings adamantly rejected the charge, noting that he had long been a staunch supporter of Israel, and that he was simply stating the obvious, not making an untruthful claim. He demanded that his critics apologize to me for talking about anti-Semitism. A handful of other public figures, Patrick Buchanan, Arnaud de Bourchgrave, Maureen Dowd, Georgie Ann Geyer, Gary Hart, Chris Matthews, Congressman James P. Moran, Democrat, Virginia, Robert Novak, Tim Russert, and General Anthony Zinni either said or strongly hinted that pro-Israel hardliners in the United States were the principal movers behind the Iraq War. In Novak's case, he referred to the war well before it happened as Sharon's War, and continues to do so today. "I am convinced," he said in April 2007, "that Israel made a large contribution to the decision to embark on this war. I know that on the eve of the war, Sharon said in a closed conversation with senators that if they could succeed in getting rid of Saddam Hussein, it would solve Israel's security problems. The connection between Israel and the Iraq War was widely recognized long before the fighting started. When the prospect of an American invasion was beginning to dominate the headlines in the fall of 2002, the journalist Michael Kinsley wrote that the lack of public discussion about the role of Israel is the proverbial elephant in the room. Everybody sees it, no one mentions it. The reason for this reluctance, he observed, was fear of being labeled an anti-Semite. 2 weeks before the war started, Nathan Gutman reported in Haaretz that the voices linking Israel to the war are getting louder and louder. It is claimed the desire to help Israel is the major reason for President George Bush sending American soldiers to a superfluous war in the Gulf. And the voices come from all directions. A few days later, Bill Keller, who is now the executive editor of the New York Times, wrote, "The idea that this war is about Israel is persistent and more widely held than you may think." Finally, in May 2005, 2 years after the war began, Barry Jacobs of the American Jewish Committee acknowledged that the belief that Israel and the neoconservatives were responsible for getting the United States to invade Iraq was pervasive in the U.S. intelligence community. Some will surely argue that anyone who suggests that concerns about Israel's security had a significant influence on the Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq is either an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. Such charges are both predictable and false. As we will now show, there is abundant evidence that Israel and the lobby played crucial roles in making that war happen. This is not to assert that either Israel or the lobby controls U.S. foreign policy. It is simply to say that they successfully pressed for a particular set of policies and were able, in a particular context, to achieve their objective. Had the circumstances been different, they would not have been able to get the United States to go to war. But without their efforts, America would probably not be in Iraq today. Israel and the Iraq War. Israel has always considered Iraq an enemy, but it became especially concerned about Iraq in the mid-1970s, when France agreed to provide Saddam with a nuclear reactor. For good reason, Israel worried that Iraq might use the reactor as a stepping stone to building nuclear weapons. Responding to the threat, in 1981, the Israelis bombed the Osirak reactor before it became operational. Despite this setback, Iraq continued working on its nuclear program in dispersed and secret locations. This situation helps explain Israel's enthusiastic support for the first Gulf War in 1991. Its main concern was not to push Iraqi troops out of Kuwait, but to topple Saddam, and especially to make sure that Iraq's nuclear program was dismantled. Although the United States did not remove Saddam from power, the UN inspections regime imposed on Baghdad after the war reduced but did not eliminate Israel's concerns. In fact, Haaretz reported on February 26, 2001, that Sharon believes that Iraq poses more of a threat to regional stability than Iran, due to the errant, irresponsible behavior of Saddam Hussein's regime. Sharon's comments notwithstanding, by early 2002, when it was becoming increasingly apparent that the Bush administration was thinking seriously about another war against Iraq, some Israeli leaders told U.S. officials that they thought Iran was a greater threat. They were not opposed to toppling Saddam, however, and Israel's leaders, who are rarely reticent when it comes to giving their American counterparts advice, never tried to convince the Bush administration not to go to war against Iraq. Nor did the Israeli government ever try to mobilize its supporters in the United States to lobby against the invasion. On the contrary, Israeli leaders were worried only that the United States might lose sight of the Iranian threat in its pursuit of Saddam. Once they realized that the Bush administration was countenancing a bolder scheme, one that called for winning quickly in Iraq and then dealing with Iran and Syria, they began to push vigorously for an American invasion. In short, Israel did not initiate the campaign for war against Iraq. As will become clear, it was the neoconservatives in the United States who conceived that idea and were principally responsible for pushing it forward in the wake of September 11. But Israel did join forces with the neoconservatives to help sell the war to the Bush administration and the American people, well before the president had made the final decision to invade. Indeed, Israeli leaders worried constantly in the months before the war that President Bush might decide not to go to war after all, and they did what they could to ensure Bush did not get cold feet. The Israelis began their efforts in the spring of 2002, a few months before the Bush administration launched its own campaign to sell the Iraq War to the American public. Former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came to Washington in mid-April and met with U.S. senators and the editors of the Washington Post, among others, to warn them that Saddam was developing nuclear weapons that could be delivered against the American homeland in suitcases or satchels. A few weeks later, Renan Gissin, Sharon's spokesman, told a Cleveland reporter that if Saddam Hussein is not stopped now, 5 years from now, 6 years from now, we will have to deal with an Iraq that is armed with nuclear weapons, with an Iraq that has delivery systems for weapons of mass destruction. In mid-May, Shimon Peres, the former Israeli prime minister now serving as foreign minister, appeared on CNN, where he said that Saddam Hussein is as dangerous as bin Laden, and the United States cannot sit and wait while he builds a nuclear arsenal. Instead, Peres insisted it was time to topple the Iraqi leader. A month later, Ehud Barak, another former Israeli prime minister, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post recommending that the Bush administration should, first of all, focus on Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein. Once he is gone, there will be a different Arab world. On August 12, 2002, Sharon told the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee of the Knesset that Iraq is the greatest danger facing Israel. Then, on August 16, 10 days before Vice President Cheney kicked off the campaign for war with a speech to the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention in Nashville, Tennessee, several newspapers and television and radio networks, including Haaretz, The Washington Post, CNN, and CBS News, reported that Israel was urging the United States not to delay an attack on Iraq. Sharon told the Bush administration that postponing the operation will not create a more convenient environment for action in the future. Putting off an attack, Renan Gissin said, would only give him, Saddam, more of an opportunity to accelerate his program of weapons of mass destruction. Foreign Minister Peres told CNN that the problem today is not if, but when. Postponing an attack would be a grave mistake, he said, because Saddam would be better armed down the road. Deputy Defense Minister Weitzman Shiri offered a similar view, warning, if the Americans do not do this now, it will be harder to do it in the future. In a year or two, Saddam Hussein will be further along in developing weapons of mass destruction. Perhaps CBS best captured what was going on in the headline for its story, Israel to U.S. Don't delay, Peres and Sharon both made sure to emphasize that they did not want to be seen as urging the United States to act, and that America should act according to its own judgment. Israeli leaders and many of their supporters in the United States were well aware that some American commentators, most notably Patrick Buchanan, had argued that the driving force behind the 1991 Gulf War was the Israeli Defense Ministry and its Amen corner in the United States. Denying any responsibility made good political sense, but there is no question, based on their own public comments, that by August 2002, Israel's leaders saw Saddam as a threat to the Jewish state and were encouraging the Bush administration to launch a war to remove him from power. News stories around the same time also reported that Israeli intelligence officials have gathered evidence that Iraq is speeding up efforts to produce biological and chemical weapons. Peres told CNN that "We think and know that he, Saddam, is on his way to acquiring a nuclear option." Haaretz reported that Saddam had given an order to Iraq's Atomic Energy Commission last week to speed up its work. Israel was feeding these alarming reports about Iraq's WMD programs to Washington at a time when, by Sharon's own reckoning, strategic coordination between Israel and the U.S. has reached unprecedented dimensions. Following the invasion and the revelation that there were no WMD in Iraq, the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Israeli Knesset released separate reports revealing that much of the intelligence Israel gave to the Bush administration was false. As one retired Israeli general put it, Israeli intelligence was a full partner to the picture presented by American and British intelligence regarding Iraq's non-conventional capabilities. Of course, Israel is hardly the first state to push another country to take a costly or risky action on its behalf. States facing external dangers often try to pass the buck to others, and the United States has a rich tradition of similar behavior itself. It backed Saddam Hussein in the 1980s in order to help contain the threat from revolutionary Iran, and it armed and backed the Afghan Mujahideen following the Soviet invasion of that country in 1979. The United States did not send its own troops to fight these wars. It merely did what it could to help others, who had their own reasons for fighting, do the heavy lifting. Given their understandable desire to have the United States eliminate a regional rival, it is not surprising that Israeli leaders were distressed when President Bush decided to seek UN Security Council authorization for war in September 2002, and even more worried when Saddam agreed to let UN inspectors back into Iraq. These developments troubled Israel's leaders because they seemed to reduce the likelihood of war. Foreign Minister Peres told reporters, "The campaign against Saddam Hussein is a must. Inspections and inspectors are good for decent people, but dishonest people can overcome easily inspections and inspectors." On a visit to Moscow in late September, Sharon made it clear to Russian President Vladimir Putin, who was leading the charge for new inspections, that it was too late for them to be effective. Peres became so frustrated with the UN process in the following months that in mid-February 2003 he lashed out at France by questioning its status as a permanent member of the Security Council. Israel's adamant opposition to inspections put it in a lonely and awkward position, as Mark Perlman made clear in an article in The Forward in mid-September 2002. Saddam Hussein's surprise acceptance of unconditional United Nations weapons inspections put Israel on the hot seat this week, forcing it into the open as the only nation actively supporting the Bush administration's goal of Iraqi regime change. Pressing ahead in the face of UN diplomacy, Israelis portrayed Saddam in the direst terms, often comparing him to Adolf Hitler. If the West did not stand up to Iraq, they claimed, it would be making the same mistake it made with Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Shlomo Avineri, a prominent Israeli scholar, wrote in the Los Angeles Times that all who condemn the 1930s appeasement of Germany should reflect long and hard on whether a failure to act today against Iraq will one day be viewed the same way. The implication was unmistakable. Anyone who opposed invading Iraq, or, as we have seen, pushed Israel to negotiate with the Palestinians, was an appeaser, just like Neville Chamberlain, and bound to be regarded as such by future generations. The Jerusalem Post was especially hawkish, frequently running editorials and op-eds favoring the war, and rarely running pieces arguing against it. Indeed, it went so far as to editorialize that ousting Saddam is the linchpin of the war on terrorism, without which it is impossible to begin in earnest. Other Israeli public figures echoed Peres and Sharon's advocacy for war instead of diplomatic wrangling. Former Prime Minister Ehud Barak wrote a New York Times op-ed in early September 2002, claiming that Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program provides the urgent need for his removal. He went on to warn that the greatest risk now lies in inaction. His predecessor, Benjamin Netanyahu, published a similar piece a few weeks later in the Wall Street Journal titled "The Case for Toppling Saddam." Netanyahu declared, "Today, nothing less than dismantling his regime will do," adding that, "I believe I speak for the overwhelming majority of Israelis in supporting a preemptive strike against Saddam's regime, which he claimed was feverishly trying to acquire nuclear weapons." Netanyahu's influence, of course, extended well beyond writing op-eds and appearing on television. Having gone to high school, college, and graduate school in the United States, he speaks fluent English and is not only familiar with how the American political system works, but operates skillfully in it. He has close ties with neoconservatives inside and outside of the Bush administration, and he has extensive contacts on Capitol Hill, where he has either spoken or testified on numerous occasions. Barak is also well connected with American policymakers, politicians, security experts, and pundits. The Israeli government's war fervor did not diminish in the months before the fighting started. Haaretz, for example, ran a story on February 17, 2003, titled, "Enthusiastic IDF Awaits War in Iraq," which said that Israel's military and political leadership yearns for war in Iraq. 10 days later, James Bennett wrote a story in the New York Times with the headline, "Israel Says War on Iraq Would Benefit the Region." The Forward published a piece on March 7, 2003, titled, "Jerusalem Frets as U.S. Battles Iraq War Delays," which made it clear that Israel's leaders were hoping for war sooner rather than later. Given all this activity, it is unsurprising that Bill Clinton recounted in 2006 that every Israeli politician I knew believed that Saddam Hussein was so great a threat that he should be removed even if he did not have WMD. Nor was the desire for war confined to Israel's leaders. Apart from Kuwait, which Saddam conquered in 1990, Israel was the only country outside of the United States where a majority of politicians and the public enthusiastically favored war. A poll taken in early 2002 found that 58% of Israeli Jews believed that Israel should encourage the United States to attack Iraq. Another poll, taken a year later in February 2003, found that 77.5% of Israeli Jews wanted the United States to invade Iraq. Even in Tony Blair's Britain, a poll taken just before the war revealed that 51% of the respondents opposed it, while only 39% supported it. This rather unusual situation prompted Gideon Levy of Haaretz to ask, why is it that in England 50,000 people have demonstrated against the war in Iraq, whereas in Israel no one has? Why is it that in Israel there is no public debate about whether the war is necessary? He went on to say, Israel is the only country in the West whose leaders support the war unreservedly and where no alternative opinion is voiced. Israel's enthusiasm for war eventually led some of its allies in America to tell Israeli officials to damp down their hawkish rhetoric, lest the war look like it was being fought for Israel. In the fall of 2002, for example, a group of American political consultants known as the Israel Project circulated a 6-page memorandum to key Israelis and pro-Israel leaders in the United States. The memo was titled Talking About Iraq and was intended as a guide for public statements about the war. If your goal is regime change, you must be much more careful with your language because of the potential backlash. You do not want Americans to believe that the war in Iraq is being waged to protect Israel rather than to protect America. Reflecting that same concern on the eve of the war, Sharon, according to several reports, told Israeli diplomats and politicians to keep quiet about a possible war in Iraq, and certainly not to say anything that made it appear that Israel was pushing the Bush administration to topple Saddam. The Israeli leader was worried by the growing perception that Israel was advocating a U.S. invasion of Iraq. In fact, Israel was. It just did not want its position to be widely known. The Lobby and the Iraq War. The driving force behind the Iraq War was a small band of neoconservatives who had long favored the energetic use of American power to reshape critical areas of the world. They had advocated toppling Saddam since the mid-1990s and believed this step would benefit the United States and Israel alike. This group included prominent officials in the Bush administration, such as Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, the number 2 and 3 civilians in the Pentagon, Richard Perle, Kenneth Edelman, and James Woolsey, members of the influential Defense Policy Board, Scooter Libby, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, John Bolton, Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, and his Special Assistant David Wurmser, and Elliot Abrams, who is in charge of Middle East policy at the National Security Council. It also included a handful of well-known journalists like Robert Kagan, Charles Krauthammer, William Kristol, and William Safire. The appointment of a number of neoconservatives to top policy positions was seen by Israelis and their American allies as a very positive development. When Wolfowitz was selected to be Deputy Defense Secretary in January 2001, the Jerusalem Post reported that the Jewish and pro-Israel communities are jumping with joy. In the spring of 2002, the foreword pointed out that Wolfowitz is known as the most hawkishly pro-Israel voice in the administration, and it selected him later in 2002 as the first among 50 notables who have consciously pursued Jewish activism. At about the same time, JINSA gave him its Henry M. Jackson Distinguished Service Award for promoting a strong partnership between Israel and the United States. And the Jerusalem Post, describing Wolfowitz as devoutly pro-Israel, named him its Man of the Year in 2003. Feith's role in shaping the case for war should also be understood in the context of his long-standing commitment to Israel and his prior association with hardline groups there. Feith has close ties with key organizations in the lobby, like the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs and the Zionist Organization of America. He wrote articles in the 1990s supporting the settlements and arguing that Israel should retain the occupied territories. More important, as we noted in Chapter 4, Feith was a co-author, along with Pearl and Wormser, of the famous Clean Break report in June 1996. Written under the auspices of a right-wing Israeli think tank for incoming Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the report recommended, among other things, that Netanyahu focus on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, an important Israeli strategic objective in its own right. It also called for Israel to take steps to reorder the entire Middle East. Netanyahu did not implement their advice, but Feith, Pearl, and Wormser were soon advocating that the Bush administration pursue those same goals. This situation prompted Haaretz columnist Akiva Eldar to warn that Feith and Pearl are walking a fine line between their loyalty to American governments and Israeli interests. As George Packer notes in The Assassin's Gate, for Feith and Wormser, the security of Israel was probably the prime mover behind their support for the war. John Bolton and Scooter Libby are staunch supporters of Israel as well. As America's ambassador to the UN, Bolton consistently and enthusiastically defended Israel's interests. So much so, in fact, that in May 2006, the Israeli ambassador to the UN jokingly described Bolton as a secret member of Israel's own team at the United Nations. He went on to say that the secret is out. We really are not just 5 diplomats, we are at least 6, including John Bolton. When Bolton's controversial reappointment to that position became an issue later in 2006, pro-Israel groups weighed in on Bolton's side. Regarding Libby, the Forward reported when he left the White House in the fall of 2005 that Israeli officials liked Libby. They described him as an important contact who was accessible, genuinely interested in Israel-related issues, and very sympathetic to their cause. Neoconservatives outside the Bush administration are every bit as devoted to Israel as are their compatriots in the government. Consider the comments that columnist Charles Krauthammer made in Jerusalem on June 10, 2002, after receiving the Guardian of Zion Award from Bar-Ilan University. The theme of his talk was characterizing Israel's participation in the Oslo peace process as an example of misguided Jewish messianism. In his remarks, Krauthammer explicitly identified himself with Israel, indeed as Israeli. At one point, he observed that 35 years ago today, the Six-Day War ended. It seemed like a new era. Jerusalem had been reunited. The Temple Mount was ours, Israel. He went on to say, "My thesis tonight is that many of our troubles today, as a people and as a Jewish state, are rooted precisely in this new messianic enthusiasm." Krauthammer, like virtually all other neoconservative pundits, was a relentless advocate for war right up until the invasion. Although many of the prominent neoconservatives were Jewish Americans with strong attachments to Israel, some of the leading members of the pro-war party were not. In addition to John Bolton, the signatories of the open letters to Presidents Bush and Clinton, sponsored by the Project for the New American Century, included Gentiles such as former CIA Director James Woolsey and former Secretary of Education William Bennett. Woolsey was particularly obsessed with proving that Saddam was responsible for 9/11, and he devoted considerable effort trying to confirm an early report that Mohammed Atta, one of the 9/11 hijackers, had met with an Iraqi intelligence agent in Prague. The story was implausible and is widely believed to be false. But Woolsey and Vice President Dick Cheney both invoked it to bolster the case for war.